Thank you. Thanks everybody for coming out tonight. We really appreciate your being here with us. In advance of tonight's panel discussion, I was asked to spend just a few minutes taking us down memory lane, talking about how we got here, talking a little bit about the history of mobile devices, what it means to the conversation about web apps versus native apps, and how that really impacts what we see today, which really is a hybridization of apps that span across both native and mobile devices. So let's begin. Everybody remembers the original iPhone? Steve Jobs says in 2007, famously, who needs a native ability in an SDK to develop on that platform? Only Apple has the ability to develop on it initially, and he suggests that HTML5 and the access to what at that point was head and shoulders the very best mobile browser available in mobile Safari was all anybody ever needed in order to develop for mobile devices. Okay, well, let's move forward a year later and, hearing the throngs of impassioned pleas from developers and, well, all of us, Apple comes out with iOS 2 and, well, iPhone OS 2 and the SDK. That was really handy. But again, HTML5, not a lot of additional assistance here. Immature platform, and it's growing increasingly irrelevant as there's ever more connectivity between the device and the operating system. But let's not just talk about Apple, let's also talk about Android. The initial T-Mobile G1, the first real Android device on Android 1, Android 1.1, similar story. Really interesting widgets on the homepage, no way to develop for them from third parties. Sounds familiar, but Gmail, it's there, and it works really well from day one, still does today. A year later, 2009, iPhone 3GS comes out. Now we're talking about iOS 3. A lot of improvements in the SDK, a lot of improvements in the API. Now we've got real cut, copy, and paste, something that Android sort of had from day one, but not so well. Apple thinks they got it right, and still HTML5 sort of now ever more ghettoized inside Safari. Okay, everybody with me? All right, so 2009, what happens on the Android side? We've got two versions of Android released in 2009, 1.5, 2.1. We've got some slightly better versions of cut, copy, and paste, Google Live Status, and some interactivity between live events that are going out in the world and what's going on the mobile device. And for the first time, we see camera support that's natively baked in to the operating system. But again, as we all know on the Android side, that's really up to individual mobile hardware developers and platform folks to either release or not release. And we're seeing at this point at Android 1.5, and especially on 2.1, the very first point where we're seeing the network operators play a more heavy hand in exactly what the experience looks like. The version on T-Mobile, vastly different from what you see on Verizon. Okay, so big brother of iPad comes along in the time frame of 2010. We're talking about iOS 3.2. We're really calling it iOS now, and iOS 4. Now we've got something really interesting going on in terms of Game Center. So Apple trying its very level best to take away some market share from third-party players like OpenFate who are trying to grab some of this game market. But this is the first time where something very interesting happens with what up to this point were just plain old off-the-shelf vanilla games. Anyone remember Angry Birds when it first came out? Anyone remember that? It was just a game. You played it. The birds ran into the pigs, and that's all it did. There were no scoreboards. There was no comparing your score against a friend's unless you were sitting next to your friend, right? Okay, well, Game Center changes all of that. Now you've got a global community of people playing together, and that scoreboard pushes into the app. So this is, strangely, through games, the first real hybridization of these apps, where we're looking for a real need for always-on communication using the network into the game as well. Okay, starting to get interesting. Android starts playing the same game too, and this is the first time that we see NFC support on the device. Again, up to individual carriers to allow. Most don't allow it, but it's there starting in 2010. 2011. Now we've got on the Apple side lots of interesting things going on in terms of Siri and Notification Center, really bridging a gap that Apple had been lacking a long time because notifications had been native on Android from the very beginning. And yet still, HTML5, it lingers, it lingers, it lingers. 2011 was really interesting on the Android side. Why? Because it was the first time that Android basically forked their code. They started the year in January at the Consumer Electronics Show by announcing something very new, a platform only for tablets. And it was really interesting. I had the privilege of being in the audience that day when they announced Android 3. It was inside the Verizon keynote, and they passed it over to Motorola. At that time, looking back, you can understand the love fest that was going on because we didn't realize that Google was about to acquire that part of Motorola yet. But interesting, and they handed off to Motorola to tell us all about their great new Zoom. That didn't go so well, but it was a really interesting piece of hardware. And they, in turn over the program to Google to tell us all about how wonderful this brand new platform is. Lots of more integration, greater multitasking, a real pervasive experience that really ties together the hardware and software together in a way that we'd really never seen before on the Android platform. Really high responsiveness. And then we see that, of course, through today with Ice Cream Sandwich and the most recent release. Okay, so here's Murderer's Row of the mobile devices. What is the point? The point is, only 3 or 4 years ago, there really were only two ends of the spectrum and very little in between. Native apps on one side, they needed no access to the network. They stood alone. They worked well. It was a great experience inside the app, but nothing else doing. All the way on the other end, a web app for things like account management and transactions, things that you could not do 4 or 5 years ago inside a native app. What does that look like today? Well, it starts looking very interesting. It's not so simple. It's on multiple axes, where we've got, if you're looking here on the y-axis, something between device-agnostic experiences. It works well on anything, sort of, all the way down to a device-tailored experience, right? That native app feeling. Here on the x-axis, we're describing this notion of whether you really need connectivity or not. And what we're seeing is that the notion of a native app is really going away. Almost all native apps require some network connectivity. We expect that they talk to a larger social network in order to work well. So the notion of hybrid apps and what that means to me is really sets the stage very nicely for our panel today, who are going to provide you some very interesting background between examples of what we would traditionally have called a native app, but is increasingly hybridized. We have a provider who's going to talk to us about a real live web app that is exactly that and does its job really well, and some other flavors in between. And so with that, let me introduce my colleague, Bill Annabelle, the Chief Technology Officer of Sapient, who's going to moderate our panel. Bill?